here because I didn't record any of that. Frame by frame animation. Go check it out if you use Facebook. Okay, now everybody's caught up. So I used to do a thing in this class that I don't think I'm going to do anymore, which is I would give you an in-class test. Y'all remember that? For those of you who have taken it before, you'll remember that in-class test. We're not going to do that, but I do want you to get out a piece of paper because I want you to try, and if you have a pen and a Cintiq, that's fine too. You can just draw it in Photoshop. I'm going to, in just a minute, I'm going to start showing you some motions, and I'm going to ask you to start thinking about what that curve looks like, right? So, but we're not going to do that yet, right? So I'm just giving you some time to prepare. Right now what I'd like to do is look at our, let me go ahead and break this out into, let's see, panels, layout. Let's do 2 planes split, stacked, and panels, perspective, panels into our, you got a broken crown? That'll work. Broken crown works. So,
what are we doing, Greg?
I'll show you in a minute.
I'm so excited.
It's more than anything, I'm going to ask you questions out loud. Basically, I'm going to show you some stuff here in a minute. I'm going to be like, what do you think that curve looks like? And then I want you to try to draw that curve that is making that action. So we'll get to that here in a minute. So, so this is just a box moving from one side to the other, right? It's 48 frames of this box moving across our screen, right? So the first thing I think is important to acknowledge is that all of this motion is happening in one axis. Which axis is that? I'm giving you a hint up on the screen.
X, right?
Z.
No, you're right. Z.
Oh, X.
Yeah, it's X because there's our red axis, right? X, Y, Z, RGB. So, oh, so yeah, I can see where you can see that over there on the, yeah. So, that means that the only change in any of these curves is in my translate X, right? So what if there were change in my translate Y? What would that affect?
That'd be up and down, right?
Yeah.
Up and down, right? So the curve would move up and down, or the action would move up and down. To be able to see that, I could go in here, curves. I'll go ahead, or keys, add key tool. So some of you probably are familiar with this, and then hit middle click to add a key, and move that up to there. And so now I get this motion out of it, right?
Greg, are you a wizard?
I am. Animation wizard. So how many of you remember the graph editor arrow from Animation Fundamentals? Does it still wake you up in the middle of the night? A cold sweat? XYZ. So the graph editor arrow was to sort of remind you of all of this, right? Or to make you exercise all of this. When we're posing, we're creating these poses in 3D space. This is not really in our head that much, right? I mean, you may think, oh yeah, I need to rotate that in the x-axis to make it go in one direction, and you may remember that that's the x-axis, but your brain is not generating curves as you think of that motion. You're thinking of how we move through 3D space, right? And you're thinking like, this is how I go from point A to point B. It's what you should be thinking about at that point, right? It's how to communicate that action in a real depth environment, right? Timing, all of that stuff. And so before we jump into this phase, you want to make sure that all of that is where you want it to be. You've gotten it to the point that you're happy with the results, right? So when we jump into the graph editor, I think that we have to remember that all that posing we were doing was changing all of these channels, right? Depending on the control, right? Your character's hips, you're changing both the translate X, Y, and Z and the rotate X, Y, and Z. You made choices about where to position that and how to orient that character's root control in all 6 of those channels, right? And all 6 of those channels are changing throughout your entire animation. And so you can change one curve and it's drastically going to affect one of the other curves. So what I'd like to do though is just kind of remind you how powerful the graph editor is. Obviously, as I showed you earlier, the add key tool is something I use a lot. It's right there, but what I actually usually do is go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Hotkey Editor. Did I just crash mine? There we go. Choose a category, I go to Editors, select an editor, I choose Graph Editor, and then this Add Key tool, I usually map that to T. T already has a function in there, but it's not one that I use very often. If you have a key you like better, that's fine. But that means basically anytime I hit the letter T while I'm in the Graph Editor, I can add that key tool. So to remind you how that works, if I hit T, you'll see that the Add Key tool is there. I can't add anything until I've selected something. So if I select that curve, I middle click, I have to hit T again apparently. I middle click T and I can add that key wherever, and as long as I'm holding down middle click, I can go through here and I can literally like draw whatever curve I want for this, right? And so I can change it to that motion, right? This is, so I think it's worth remembering that this is where you're going to do that finite changes, or those very fine changes to the motion, right, to clean it up. Now we'll undo all that. So sometimes though you don't need to add more keys, you just need to change the way these curves happen, right? So let's just look at the curve that is changing. We got sliding from side to side, right? One of the things I think is worth checking out here is if I go to Animation and choose Visualize, and I'm going to create an editable motion trail. You'll see that now I get this line, right? It's happening. If I select that curve or that line, I can go to my attribute editor and choose Show Frame Crosses. Let's go ahead and make those a little bit bigger so you can see them. You'll see I have a little tick mark on each of my frames of my animation, right? Not my keyframes, but my frames. So so this makes sense, right? My curve is easing out at the beginning, easing in at the end, and that means my spacing of these frames is a little bit bigger than my spacing of these frames at the end, right? You see how this decelerates and they get slower or smaller and smaller, right? So when we were talking about spacing, easing in and out, that is exactly what we're adjusting in our graph editor. So what if I wanted my spacing to be the same on all of those? How would I change this curve?
Maybe a straight line.
Linear.
Yeah, it'd be a straight line, right? So one of the ways I can do that, I mean, I could manually go in here. That's so annoying. Let me show you how to fix this. Right now what happens is every time I select, I can go to X, but if I drag and select this, all my curves come back. That's under View, and I think it's
Wouldn't it be the recycling one?
the what?
The one above the draft editor, like the menu with the when the arrows going in circles.
Oh yeah, I'm just trying to fix this little thing that's happening right now where it's lock play range, key view. They've changed this. Did it work? No. It's like an auto. Is it this?
Yeah, that's what, yeah.
Auto
Yeah.
graph editor. Yeah, okay, that fixes that. Okay, so to make this where the spacing is all even, you just select everything, set this to linear, set this right here, right? And so now the space that it changes every frame is the same. And that makes sense, right? The incline of this is the same, versus when this is at auto, the distance that it travels and the distance that this curve changes from frame 2 to 3 is not very much, but the distance it changes from frame 20 to 21 is much bigger. So I could go to linear, and we're going to get a very different animation on this. Right? So I think that what I'd like you to kind of be aware of is how much control I can have about the way this thing moves just within the graph editor. One of the other presets when we were talking about enable stepped preview, if I just set it to this right here, this little set of steps here, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to hold it and then snap to the end. Right? And so that's going to hold that one frame, snap to the end. That's what enable stepped preview is simulating. Right? I can go back to auto again. We get the same thing. There's a couple of new ones in here that I think are kind of neat, these little green options here. If I set this to linear, but then I just select this second key, I can set the in tangent, the way it comes into this keyframe, to auto. Auto. Did that not work? I've actually never used this, so apparently so. Well, never mind then. So I can just set this one to auto, and we're going to get this transition here. So I think recognize that we can also adjust these tangents. If I hold Shift, I can pull this out. Well, let me do that. Hold Shift. I can pull this out in a straight line and really increase the amount of deceleration. And I can adjust this as well to really change that. And so this is going to give us a much different result, right? It's going to be going really fast at the beginning, slow down a lot, right? So I do want to talk to you just a little bit about how the graph editor works. I know some of you are probably really familiar with this, but one of the things that really slows people down in the graph editor is the idea that you have to go in here and click this tangent handle exactly and move it around. If you are using your left click button, right, the one you usually click with your index finger, that is how it works. I have to go in here and select it and move it. Right? However, if I'm using my middle mouse button, I can click anywhere and move it. So if I highlight this keyframe, then I drag select this tangent, I can be over here and middle click and adjust my tangent. And this is really going to increase the speed in which you are editing your stuff, right? So really my quick way of editing things, drag select the key, drag select the tangent, middle mouse click to adjust. Okay.
Is there a hotkey to control just one, or do you have to break it up every time?
Oh,
Like
the tangents?
Side of a full tangent.
Yeah, I don't know. There probably is a hotkey. If not, it's this button right here, the break tangent button. You could probably turn on a hotkey if there isn't one. Like you could create one for it. You know what? I say that, but there used to be. I know that there is one in Macs. It does not appear. I know Shift will hold it in constraint. No, well, that's not what I wanted. Also, don't forget these framing buttons are here. This button will frame the full thing. This button will sort of frame your timeline. Alt, right click will zoom in and out. Shift Alt, right click will zoom in and out in one axis or the other. Okay. So we get all of that. Hopefully these are not surprises to you. But I think it's important to recognize that some things are just easier to animate in the graph editor, right? like if I wanted this to look like it was hitting a wall over here, let's go ahead and do this. I want it to look like it smacks into this wall and kind of bounces off of it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and grab this. All right, grab my Translate X. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change where this actually stops. Right, I can drag that down and make it hit right there. So the first thing I very quickly was able to do is make it look like it changed its end location. But if I want it to look like it smacks that wall, I can do sort of the opposite of what we just did. And I can break this tangent and get something like this. And it smacks the wall. Now, where this becomes really powerful is if I want to add that little dunk, 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 like I want to get like some pop to it, like it hits it and sort of bounces off a few times. I can just go ahead and add more keys to this. So T, add that more keys, get it up here, and then W, grab this, break these tangents, T. I'm just going through here and kind of a little bit much. And then I can always go in here and adjust this to get okay. So I feel like most of you are pretty familiar with the graph editor. How many of you are I feel like that very early on I've been making an effort in the animation concentration to force you into the graph editor, so by the time you get to this point, you're not scared of it, right? It doesn't feel intimidating to you. If you're still struggling with it, that's okay. I still fight with it sometimes too, just to make it do exactly what I want it to do. What really needs to happen though is at this point, that fear should not be stopping you from opening it, right? You should open the graph editor just as readily as you hit the W key or the E key to rotate something. It's another tool within Maya that you should be able to use. So just to make sure we're all feeling kind of confident in it, I thought we would try some exercises, yeah, some in-class brain stretches, right? So I'm going to hide my graph editor. And then I'm also going to go ahead and delete this curve. Actually, I'll delete both of those. And I'm going to open up some letters here.
Nice.
Boxes and trails. So just to make this a little easier on us, I was going to try hiding them one at a time, but I don't think I can. So let's try focusing in on A, right? Box A, so I think the first thing that I want to point out, each of these boxes, with the exception of J, have the same first and last keyframe. If this helps too, I'm sharing through Zoom. You can open that up and see it on your screen. So they have the same first and last keyframe. Actually, we can have it on J too. I just take it a little bit past it. So what I'd like you to do is for A, on that little piece of paper I had you pull out, why don't you try to draw what you think that curve might look like? So you can just draw a box in there.
On what? On X?
Yes, on X. The only motion that's on any of these should be on X.
So right. I want to see what the curve looks like for each of them.
Yeah, I can zoom in a little bit more. So let's try. So we're just focusing in on A. Now I'm not going to grade this or anything. I just want you to kind of give you a few minutes to try to think through that, right? What you think that curve looks like on A. Okay. So hopefully everybody's had a minute or two to think about it. What are some of the telltale signs that clued you into the curve that you drew? What are some of the things that made you think that what you're drawing is correct? Okay. Yeah, so it is very even right through the middle, but you are noticing, like some people pointed out, some ease in and some ease out at the end. So the spacing of these numbers on A, of course, is bigger in the middle than it is on each end. Right? So what curve did you draw? Yeah, I like this hand. Yeah, so we get this sort of S shape. Is that what you?
Flattened S or something.
Flattened S. Okay. Let's.
The classic graph.
The default.
The default, right? So let's go ahead and select that. We'll open this up. Try selecting it again because apparently that didn't work.
Using like this.
Frame. Oh, maybe I turned off. Oh, there we go. So y'all had it right. Good job.
You're so smart.
So.
Why are you laughing?
I didn't laugh. Let's go ahead and expand this a little bit more so you can see B. So, what about B? Let's look at B. Take a second and draw what you think B looks like. You already drew it? Yeah, come way ahead. I've already done all the way through I. I got it. So what do you think? What's some of the clues that are leading you to the decisions you're making and what you're drawing there? What do you think that looks like?
Just constant speed.
Yeah, constant speed. What did you say?
Oh, is it?
Yeah, no easing at all at the beginning or end, right? It's the same spacing on each piece. What do we call that? Constant is pretty good, but boring. So, huh? Linear, right? Because we know that change is probably in a straight line. So most of you probably just drew a diagonal line, right? Now it's diagonal because if it were flat, what would the box be doing? Nothing, right? So let's go ahead and look at that and see if we were right. Yep. There it is. So, what about C?
Should we answer or give them time to think?
Go ahead and draw it on your paper first. Give everybody just a second to draw it on the paper. So what do you think C looks like? Now you can answer.
Well, it starts off really straight, and then it starts to curve.
Like a sharp upward hill that
So,
It's kind of like a hill, like you go up, and then
Yeah.
kind of like
yeah.
yeah. So let's practice using some animation terms for that, right?
refuse.
So you refuse that. So we're leaving keyframe A. It's a fast out, right? The tangent is broken there. It's a fast out, right?
There's not a lot of spacing between the first couple frames. It's like the spacing is very large.
Right, yeah. So big spacing between these first ones. And the tangent, we have an out tangent that is not easing out, right? It's fast out, right? The key at the end, what are we doing with it? We're easing into it, right? Like it's a slow deceleration into that. Okay, so we're all good there, and you were correct. Good job. Look at that. Nice curve. D is actually pretty easy. What does it look like?
Opposite.
The opposite, right? So if you drew that curve, this one is easing out and going fast in on D, right? Okay, now we're going to get to some little bit of a harder one. What is happening on E?
Baby stuff.
So here's the thing. Here's the trick to this one. There's still only 2 keyframes on E. What do you think that curve looks like? So let's look at your before we. I know a few of you have some answers already, but let's think about how to analyze this. Right, up and down in your graph editor is the amount of change we're getting. Right, so at the beginning and ending of this, we're getting a lot of change in the spacing. The middle part, we're not getting as much change. Right, but time didn't slow down. Time's going to continue to move forward, right? And in your graph editor, side to side is time. So what we would expect to see, I think, is actually before I answer, what do you all think it looks like? You can do the air draw if you'd like.
Smile.
Like a rainbow.
A smile.
It's like a smile.
Okay. How many of you think smile? Oh, you're thinking rainbow, so inverted smile.
Yeah.
Turn that frown upside down.
I think it's a hill.
No, I think it speeds up and then flattens out and then goes something like that.
Oh, no.
Oh. So think about that. If it's a smile, that means that change that's happening, or that location of our translate x, is going to start in point A, but at the end, that same height, or that same value, right? So a smile would look like it goes all the way to the end and then comes back to the beginning, right? So, or a rainbow, either one. So yeah, you're actually right. Let's look at how that works. Because if we open this up, it's something like that, right? It's going fast at the beginning, and then it slows down its transition here in the middle. Goes fast at the end. Okay. So this is really interesting to me because so far all of these different motions, A through E, came from the same 2 keyframes, right? So what about F? F is a little different. You'll notice that F has an extra keyframe right in the middle, right? Frame 24 there is one more keyframe on it, right? So, but look what's happening. We're easing out at the beginning, going fast around frames 12 and 13, easing into frame 24, easing back out of 24, fast around 36 and 37, and easing into frame 48. So what do you think that looks like? I'll give you a couple more seconds to draw that one.
Oh, gosh, Brian. Why do you have to make me use my brain glasses?
I didn't come to school to think.
I did.
Okay. Anybody think they have the answer on this one?
I'm a guess.
Bottom?
I would guess something like that.
Getting close, yeah. Is it do it?
The inverted version of that?
Kind of looks like a childhood like seagull shape. You know what I'm talking about? Oh, double.
I know it. W.
Like I'm trying to like.
W.
I'm trying to like imagine
You
C
just
and
like
D.
take off the
Yeah,
leg
yeah.
over top of yeah.
No.
And you kind of like
I'm
tilt it.
imagining
Yeah.
C put together.
I got
It should
you.
be very similar.
Yeah. So let's just go ahead and look at this one then. F is going to look a lot more like a hill with a little plateau in the middle of it, right? You get this little flattened spot. As we climb the hill, it flattens out right there, climbs the hill again, flattens out, right? So think about that. That means with that one key, if I have a character who's making a motion with their arm, right? They're raising their arm up in the air, right? When I'm looking at my animation and it feels like it kind of hesitates in the middle and then goes up again, we may suspect that this is what the curve is doing, right? There's a little flattened spot in that tangent that slows it down in the middle before it continues up. So, I mean, if I wanted to change that, I mean, I could just set this to auto, right? and that completely changes and gets that that transition that we might want, right? So let me let you see that while it's playing through the curve. Right? So it almost comes to a complete stop right in the middle. Okay. This is I don't know, this is kind of fun for me. You may hate it. Do you all hate this?
No.
Okay, a little bit.
I've been doing this 3 times.
I have no strong opinion one way or the other.
Okay, so if we hit play on G here, G is doing something really weird. Would it help if I hit some of the others? Is it hard to look at them?
It is, because I keep on, my W explanation was for G apparently, not for F, because I can't.
Let's see.
There's still only 3 keyframes though, right?
Control H.
Two.
So it'll be the top one. So it's still only 3 keyframes. One on frame 1, one on frame 24, one on frame 48. Right. So here's one of the ways you can start thinking of this. Let me let it play while you're thinking about it. Your x-axis represents the forward and back location of this this box, right? So as our curve goes upward, our box goes in which direction? Yeah, forward, right? Toward that way. Yeah. So that means if we want the curve to, or that we want the box to turn around, the curve has to go down, right? So we have 2 keyframes, or 3 keyframes. How am I making that curve go up and down? It appears to be like multiple times, like 4
Breaking
times.
the tangents. Like a
Breaking.
wave.
Maybe.
Something.
Below,
Did you
right?
take down?
You go into the negative number.
Go into the-
to the
Right. So recognize that our tangent, like this is something you probably never do with it, but our tangent can almost tie this in a knot, right? So I can overshoot that point just by having my tangent go higher. Now, one of the things I'm not a fan of doing overshoot this way when I'm actually polishing. Like for me, if I need that to hit that point, I just put a keyframe in there and make sure that I control that point getting to there, right? But that is, this aside from where the keys are, if I understand how to make that motion out of this curve, whether I use a tangent or whether I use more keys is kind of irrelevant. Some people use more tangent stuff, some people use more keys. I'm more of a key guy. But really what we're getting is if we want something to overshoot, we can do that by having the curve go past our end destination and come back to it. Right? And so that's what we're getting. It eases out at the beginning, it goes past our key 2 and then comes back to key 2, and then goes like back toward our starting point, and then reverses again and goes to the end. Right? So if we watch that play, it's up here a little bit. Okay. So H. H should be a little easier for you. What's H doing?
Step.
Stepped, right? Now, why would we need stepped?
So we can block the poses. Like
So-
using the key poses.
So obviously when we're blocking, it's really handy for that. Would we ever use stepped for a final piece of animation?
Maybe for like a flashing
Actually,
light or something.
it's starting to become a style.
If it's really stylized,
Yeah.
like it's supposed to be really zippy, then yes.
You can make camera cuts on a single camera with it.
Like in 2D, when you have actions that are supposed to be going from like one post to just the next post, you would do that as well in 3D.
Yeah, you could do that. So, but I think Dylan brought up a really cool point here. There are some things that we need to be very like binary. It's either on or it's off, like a light switch, right? You could set stepped keys on a light's intensity value and turn it on and off whenever you wanted to, right? Most motion, we usually don't see it in there a lot in character animation, but there are ways of using it. I have a feeling like Spider-Verse, where everything is set on 2s, that means that they are literally baking the keyframes down to every second keyframe, and setting it to stepped mode. There's a little bit more involved to it than that, but that is some of what's happening there, that you're holding that for 2 frames before you pop to the next frame. So there are lots of reasons that you may need this, even in the final phases of this. Changing something that's not motion, though, sometimes is one of those. Changing a value instantly. FK-IK switches, right? You either want your arm to be controlled by the FK controls or the IK controls. If it's controlled half by each of them, it's really hard to make your arm do something specific, right? So that might be another reason we would use that. So, all right, let's go ahead and stop this one. Let's look really quickly at I and J. They just got more complex, right? I is what we made a minute ago, right? So I'm not going to belabor that one too much. You all saw that that's kind of what we're getting out of that curve, right? I think it's important to recognize that if the curve doesn't change, that means the object stays in the same place. We may see flat curves in things like when our foot is on the ground, right? If we want our foot to stay on that location, then that curve is going to be flat, right? Most other times, though, you don't want to see flat curves like this, right? A flat curve like this means something died. And in most things, they don't ever completely stop, right? We call that a moving hold. Your character hits a pose, right? But then if they completely stop moving, you get this sense of like, did somebody hit pause for a second there before they started playing it again? They will hit that pose and then sort of hang out and pretty close to that pose, right? The only time we ever see living creatures completely still is when they're dead. Even when like somebody's sleeping, they have like blood circulating through their body, like their skin kind of has a little bit of a ripple, they're breathing, right? All of those things are there. The old school animators, like the 9 Old Men, called it keep alive. You're putting keep alive in it, right? You don't want it to feel like it died on the screen, right? In this case, though, I do want it to feel like it lost all that momentum and is resting at the end of it. That's why that goes completely flat.
So would it change if you got rid of the last key? Right?
No, it wouldn't. So as Maya is set up by default, we can see if I go to your curves and I look at well, sorry, no, it's under view and I view infinity here, you'll see that whatever the end of our last key is, Maya intends to hold that forever, right? For the rest of infinity, Maya will hold whatever your last keyframe is, and before infinity, it'll hold whatever your first keyframe is. Now, most of you are probably already familiar with the idea that we can change that setting. Right? I could set this up for our curves post-infinity to cycle, and that means it's going to just start back over from the beginning. Or our curves in post-infinity to cycle with an offset. If we extend this, you can see the sort of the result of that. Right? So, but good question. Yeah. So the last one, let's look at it really quickly. I feel like I'm taking a lot more time with this than I really meant to. So we have the, hide this one. We have the box starting a little bit further forward, right? It anticipates back, it goes forward past our end destination and settles back on our last keyframe. Now the thing you'll probably notice on this one is it has 4 keyframes. What do you think this one looks like? Other idea? Anybody?
Does it kind of dip a little when it settles on its last 2 goes?
Mm-hmm. So it's going to go past, and then the curve is going to come back. So that means it's going to go up past that and then come back. So what's it do at the beginning?
It's
going to go down, right, before, then it's going to go up, past it, and settle back. Right, this is actually one really common that you will see because anticipation and follow-through are a thing, right? We anticipate, let me go ahead and turn off my infinity. We anticipate back, we go past it, and then we settle back to it. So we overshoot, settle back to it. Now, I will show you one more thing that I think is interesting here. One of the things that I use that add key tool for a lot is that this is still a little bit boring in the way the transition happens here, right? I can add another keyframe here in the middle, and I can favor my previous pose and maybe overshoot a little sharper. Auto. And I still get that anticipation back with like a little bit of a faster. Right? So the distance that these keys are between each other is going to change sort of the energy of that motion. Right? So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop with this now. So where were we? Let me start over. Where we were at the end of last class was looking at our breakdowns. Right, I sort of walking around saw that most of you have some breakdowns set, and so I would say within the next day or so you're going to start moving into splining. So I wanted to kind of play through these. It will take a little bit of time. So this one is not a time lapse. This is real time, right? And so you'll see the issue I was having with the Euler interpolations here, right? If I set this to auto, you'll see that like right through there, right, my character is rotating in one way. And if we grab that curve, look at my x-axis. So like my x is rotating in one direction and then suddenly shoots way down to the bottom, right? Right there. And that's part of what my issue is that 0 looks the same as 360 on a curve, right? And Maya let me back up a little bit. Maya doesn't really know which one I wanted, 0 or 360. But I've added enough keyframes now that hopefully Maya is seeing that I was climbing toward 360, not hoping to pop back to 0, right? Which that isn't exactly 0, but you get the idea of the comparison there. So the way you fix this, if you watch what I do here, is I go to that curve. I actually select all my curves, and I go to curves, and it's this Euler filter right there, right under Simplify Curves. It's EULER right there. And watch what happens when I click this. Watch what happens to the red curve. So it shifts all my curves, and now she's rotating all the way around. Now there's a couple of other things that are messing up, right? Like her head and her feet. But if I run that Euler filter on them too, I start getting closer results to what I'm wanting. Curves. And then finally the feet, which are really kind of the biggest problem. I just selected both of those at the same time, run the Euler filter. And so now that flip works. Right? So in under a minute, I was able to fix the thing that would have been freaking me out if I were animating in splined mode early on. The fact that I was in stepped mode, I can ignore that. I can just focus on my curves and get a better result out of this later, right? So I think that that's part of it is this isn't always going to work, but the vast majority of the time it is, or there's another way of fixing it, right? So my thoughts is you continue to work on the stage that you're in, right? Now, I was in the blocking phase. I was in blocking plus. I keep focusing on the task at hand there, because there's a way of fixing the little things that are annoying later, right? So from there, I started splining. Well, actually, I'll show you the play blast of what I just fixed with the Euler filter or Euler filter. So this is what it looks like now in splined mode. And that's not as bad. Like, it's still like, to me, the timing is still a little sluggish. But most importantly, the things that I'm really looking to improve in this next phase: timing, ease in and out, arcs, and overlapping action. Now, next class period, I have a lecture where I'm going to go over overlapping action pretty in depth. So I'm not going to jump in too much to that, but I do have another little tool for you to use. If you actually step back out to the resources folder here, there's a PDF in here called Splining Checklist. I'm going to open this up. This is what we're going to be looking at from now until the end of, like, pretty much after you're done with your breakdown phase. This is sort of your to-do list, right? First things first, root movement. So that's that control around the character's hips. We're going to edit all necessary root curves, X, Y, Z on your translate, X, Y, Z on your rotate. And the best way to do that is to go to an angle where you can see how that curve is being manipulated, or how that curve is affecting that motion, and just focus on that motion, right? If it's the translate X and that's my character stepping forward, then I will go to the side and watch how my character goes forward and back. And I will edit that in the same way that we just edited those boxes. Right? I will be going through that curve, combing through that curve, adjusting it to get the action or the motion that I want. I'm going to check my relationship between my feet and my root. Right? So the root control is what controls our character's weight, but our feet is what is actually really making that happen in the real world. Right? Maya doesn't care about gravity, but we have to. And so for our character to shift their weight in that direction, they have to push on the ground with one of their feet, right, to make that happen. And so I want to make it, and the other thing is, if your character is falling to that side and they catch themselves, if their root motion or their root control and their foot gets to that location at the same time, it doesn't feel right. It feels like it just kind of stops and feels weird. You have to get that foot there first in order to slow your root motion down, right? So I'm going to go through and do a change on the timing of my feet, the timing of my root, in order to get that feeling corrected. And I want to make it clear, everything on this list is no longer locked to the same keyframe, right? If you need to change which keyframe that happens on just in Translate X, you can slide that key in whatever direction you want, right? So we're in here. I want this to happen a little bit later. I can slide this way, right? What this result is going to happen, though, is our graph editor is going to get much more tangled up looking, right? We're going to get way more keys in here. And that's where it gets harder to go back and edit those key poses, right? So we can offset our keyframes at this point on the individual frame level. Why can't I find that? Oh, here we go. So the last thing we're going to do, we're going to edit all necessary feet curves. Right? If we want our foot to hit the ground hard, we're going to break some tangents. If we want our foot to ease out of one pose and go fast, we're going to edit all those tangents. So when I say all necessary curves, translates and rotates if those are necessary. Right? Your forearm, the only necessary curve there is probably rotate Y, because your forearm only rotates in that one axis. Your shoulder is probably not going to have translates on it. It's just going to have rotates on it. But everything that you manipulated when you were setting those keyframes, you have to consider that curve, right? And ask yourself, like, can I improve this every time? Your spine and your torso is the next step of that. So what I want you to notice is we're starting with the root, like that thing on the hips, because all of your action from your character, all of the motion of how your character moves around the scene really originates from that root. And because of that, that means everything else is going to react to that motion, right? My arms don't really have an option. If my hips are going somewhere, my arms are going with it, right? So they're going to react to that. So if I get that root polished early, if I get that center of gravity polished earlier, whatever it's called on your character, then the rest of this is kind of reactionary to that motion, right? So your spine and your torso, I'm going to edit all necessary curves on the spine control, working up the spine, and then I'll edit all necessary curves on the head and neck if the neck is a separate control. After that, after I've gone all the way up to torso, I can start focusing on the arms. Now, some rigs will allow you to actually isolate these parts of the character. The bony rig will allow you to turn off the arms and just focus on how the character's torso is moving, right? So you're welcome to sort of turn those on and off and see how that works. On the arms, I'm going to edit all FK arm control curves, start with the shoulders and work down. Now, if you animated an IK, you would still do probably an arm pass at this point. IK can be, like, you're probably going to have little issues with IK or FK IK switching until close to the end of the animation. Because if you make a change to the spine, it may make that FK IK pop a little bit. So sometimes you have to do an FK IK pass toward the end. So, okay. Now we're going to seriously start thinking about offsetting. After we've gone all the way down the arms, all the way down, you can do a little bit on the wrists, or you probably will do the wrists and maybe a little bit on the fingers. At that point, you can start thinking about lead and follow a little more directed, right? So, for example, my hips move to the side, my spine reacts, my head reacts, right? But we talked about lead and follow the other day. All those curves are going to look nice and clean now, but we can change at which point they happen, right? So if my character sort of curls forward in this direction as they're going and then straightens up, if I start offsetting some of my keys to have the head motion happen first, and then the chest happen second, and then the hips happen third, that's going to be a little bit more like this, right? It's going to have this like snaky leading with the head feel, right? If you do it the other way, where the hips go first, the spine happens second, the head happens third, then you're going to get more of this like dragging the character's upper body around. So this is what we're talking about in lead and follow, is the hips leading and the chest and head following. Is the head leading and the chest and hips following? Is the chest leading? Like, there are times when you're like really like, you're kind of leading with your torso for this like bravado feel, right? Or maybe if you're like shy, it's the opposite. Your head and pelvis is leading and your chest is a little later, right? So you can offset those keyframes just in the timeline. You can do it in the timeline or the graph editor, whichever works for you, and just slide them earlier and later. It's a really easy thing to try, and then if it doesn't work, you undo it, right? Because like, grab all the keys for the head, slide them forward one frame. Did that make it better or worse? Worse? Control Z. Try sliding them in the other direction now. Like, and it's not trial and error. You'll be making decisions about that. But offsetting those keyframes are ways that you can really loosen it up. Because really, one of the things that will make a student animation feel like a student animation is that everything hits at the same time, right? Everything is like, all the poses are sort of hitting on the same frames. And just offsetting some of that stuff will help. So offset the root translate keys to happen one frame before the rotate keys. That's one of the tricks you can do. Because translates usually happen before rotates because of overlapping action, right? If you think of if I had a feather, right, that I was controlling with an FK chain, and I moved that feather to the side, that motion of moving to the side is what triggers that rotation of the feather bending. So that motion happens before the rotation does. So just offsetting that sometimes will help. And it's almost imperceptible, the difference it makes, but it will make the whole thing feel a little looser. Offset the spine and head controls to show lead and follow, like I was just talking about. Offset down the arms to show lead and follow. So again, if my character is very like loose and doing these kinds of gestures, the upper FK control, the shoulder FK control may happen first, elbow happen second, wrist happen third. right? But if my character is really urgent and trying to explain something to you, then the hands may happen first, the forearm would be next, and then the shoulder, right? And so those are controls that I can have. Very pointed gestures like that is often the hand leading that action. And so one of the other things we can do is offset each arm to reduce twinning. An example of that, your character makes this gesture, and that feels very stiff if they both hit exactly on the same frame and overshoot on the same frame. If you just offset one entire arm by a frame, you're going to get that. You're going to get this a little bit more of like this looseness to when one hits and the other follows through, right?
Or you can also change the posing of one of the hands. Like
Mhm.
maybe they're like closer to the screen, or maybe they're lower down a little bit.
That is a good point. And that would probably be something you would hope to catch in the blocking or blocking plus phase. But one of the ways to reduce twinning is when one side of your character is doing exactly the same as what your other side of your character does. Strangely, that happens a lot in real life. Watch somebody giving a speech. They do a lot of this, right? A lot of this, but it's because they're not thinking of their motion; they're thinking of their words that's coming out of their mouth. Offset that, right? Instead of doing this, do this, right? Like this is a little bit more interesting than this. Right? So twinning is just one of those little things you kind of try to keep your eye on. It's not like one of the 7 deadly sins or anything. Like if it happens, like you can justify it sometimes of a reason to do it. But a lot of times people do it because they weren't pushing the pose enough. So all of that is what I usually think of as splining. Polish is the stuff that most people will never notice. Who will notice it though is an animator, and those are the people who get to decide if they hire you or not. So this section is the impress the animators, right? And I say most people will never notice it. Most people will never consciously notice it. But they may notice that it doesn't feel right. They just may not be able to explain why. So some of the stuff in polish is adding detailed motion to the head where needed. So little things I think of is like when you say something really loud, maybe your head does like a little shake as it's going up, right? Something really small you'll notice is when people talk, when they accent a word, their head will move with that. They'll really accent it, right? And so you can go through your lip syncs and just add just a little bit of a head gesture on the big words, and it just loosens it up. It's a really small motion that helps. When they were in that video we were watching, when he's Fear is like pulling on the thing, and they pointed out that the shoulders were jittering. That's that polish level, right? I had detailed animation in the hands where needed. So detailed animation in the hands, like the hands are actually, there's a trick that I use. If your character is like, you'll notice in some animations that the characters feel like they're doing this, right? Like their hands are always kind of in mostly the same pose, and they're doing stuff and the pose doesn't really change. Even if it's an interesting pose, even if it's just like this, and it's like, why is their hand always in that same pose? You can sometimes you need your character to be in a similar hand pose, and it will just start to feel stiff. One of the ways you can do that is when your character's arm moves. Let's say you're starting off in this pose before the motion, but you still need to be in that pose after the motion. Somewhere in that change, somewhere in that transition, you can put a different pose in that transition to add in some drag and still end in the same pose. And what that does is that just loosens it up during that motion. Offset the fingers for lead and follow. That's, you're going to open your fist. Let's see. Yeah, so the way your fingers and hands open, your index finger usually leads that motion when it's opening, and your pinky leads that motion when it's closing. Right? Also, if you look at these two joints on the end versus this first joint in the middle, the two joints on the end often happen first when you're closing your hand, and they happen last or second when you're opening your hand, right? So you can offset your joints to sort of mix with that a little bit. You can double check your curves to eliminate noticeable pops. One of the ways you can do this is track your arcs. So track the head, arms, nose, legs, to just assure any clean arcs. Add any detail contact into fingers, stuff like that. So that means like if your character's touching something, right, and their finger always stays exactly the same, you don't feel that pressure of when your finger actually bends back. And then final, eye dart and other fine small details, right? So there's just a lot of stuff to go through here. As close as you can get to the end of this list, the better, right? But that means you don't sacrifice by skipping over something, right? What you really need to focus on is the quality of this, right? Really, when it boils down to it, time can be a problem. People don't always have enough time to get all of this stuff in during a class period. So, okay, what time is this class over? Is it 11:55 or 1:55? 2:05. Okay, cool. I didn't know how far we're pushing it. So if we don't get through all of the, I'm sorry, what?
I was just gonna say, do you think you could put that on D2L or the class server or something?
It should be in the class server already. It's in the resources folder.
Mm-hmm.
If you go, DIGM class, Greg, character animation, resources, it's there, splining checklist. So.
Oh,
Yes.
Would this list still apply if we're having 2D projects?
So, yes, it does. Unfortunately, the problem with 2D is it's a lot harder to break it up into the body parts, right? I would say what I would do is be like, for you all, splining is kind of the same thing as in-betweening, right? And so hopefully, what I would do is before you move into that in-betweening phase, I would look at all of your key poses and try to improve these things, like the lead and follow in those key poses as much as you can, the arcs, all that.
You can separate your body parts, but you're under the individual layers, so you could have your hands in a separate layer or your body in a separate layer.
It definitely applies on a rigged character. But the problem with it is a lot of times when you're doing your in-betweens, you're doing a full drawing. And so what you're really kind of doing is thinking about all of the concepts in this while you're doing those drawings. So unfortunately, you can't really break it down as easily. Like, it's really hard to offset your rotates from your translates on your spine in a drawing. But it's not as hard in a rig. So that is actually, to me, probably the hardest part, is that for 2D animation, while you're in-betweening, it's kind of like you have to keep that entire list in your head and think about all of those things while you're doing all of your in-between drawings, right? But one of the ways you can do that, and if it's helpful, is you can animate, like, the same way that they were tracking different elements with a dot. You can kind of do that with your body parts too, right? You can do a layer and just do like spheres for those, and that's why most of my first pass is usually that sphere character that we talked about in 2D animation.
Or you could do what you do in animatics and storyboards and draw like your arrows to represent like where like say if the hands can be pointing somewhere, draw the arrows to represent like where the hands can be going.
If you notice, that is why in a lot of keyframes on pen and paper animation, you will see multiple timing charts. Like they'll do a timing chart on the arm, but they may also do a timing chart for the hips. And they're like, ease in on the hips, but fast out on the hand, right? And so that's one of the reasons that's in there. Most of that stuff you can build like the groundwork for that in your key poses, and then you would add that stuff in your in-betweens. So, yeah, great question though. So. Okay, if we don't make it through these, that's cool. So for splining, I wanted to just show you a little bit though of me going through all of those steps. So literally, my translate X, I'm going through and adjusting this curve for the whole thing. So now notice the translate X curve is the character's side-to-side motion. So that's why I'm looking in this camera, right? It's where she is in this side-to-side direction. And as I comb through that whole thing, I'm just making that curve as perfect as I can. I recognize like it's very easy to just assume, okay, so then when we step to this, Y is my up and down key, and so I'm going to there and adjusting the up and down to give it a little bit more poppiness, a little bit more weight. It's very easy to assume that the decisions you made in your blocking, everything was perfect in it, and you don't want to change it, right? Because when you look at it in stepped mode, you may really like how that looks. But keep in mind that all of these changes are very subtle changes that we're making that are going to change just a little bit. And our goal is to try to get those little bitty imperceptible things out. And if we get enough of those out, it will make it stronger, right? So you saw me in there a few times, like hopping into looking at the graph. One of the things I tried doing here, breaking some tangents to get that like impact. Periodically, I'm play blasting it so I can see it play in real time. That's not as crucial anymore. Maya has that little, you'll notice that little blue line that starts to grow across the bottom of your timeline. That's animation caching, which means it should play back in the viewport a lot faster if that's happening. But I like to make sure by play blasting it out whenever I can. It's also just nice, like that's that little like gratification moment you can make. It's like, let me play blast that out. Yeah, that's looking cool, because you just made a video of it. And you're like, yeah, it's getting there. You can also save those as well. So again, you're seeing the things I'm kind of looking at. This is now on the rotate of it, and I'm changing the rotate. Recognize like the timing of these, where I add keys, how I shift keys side to side, is not something I'm being very sacred with, right? Like it's just because I put that key on that frame doesn't mean it's not supposed to be on the frame after or before it, right? This is just one channel, that rotation forward. And the more that it's not that everything has to be constantly shifted side to side, but the more that I consider that, or I don't feel locked in that, the more I can loosen up that animation and have like, you know, the rotation side to side maybe stops at frame 15, but the rotation forward and back stops at frame 17, right? So you should be able to kind of see what we're getting out of this. This is, again, I think probably one of the biggest things that I really like, I don't think students believe me on, is that I spend a lot of time on every curve, right? It's not always exciting at the beginning, especially considering you just finished a really exciting part of creating all those poses. My 2 cents is invest in Audible or something. Like, this is actually my time that I let my brain rest a little bit, because once you've done this for a while, it's not super taxing on your thoughts, right? It's like, which direction is that moving? How fast is it moving? I'll adjust that. And this is kind of the almost like the data entry part. It's not got a lot of creativity involved in this. So I'll put on an audiobook and I'll just go to town and edit curves all day long. So I'm finally down to rotate Z on this. I know this video is a little long. And just rotating each channel just to make it happen. I think I'm adding a little bit where I need it for additional keyframes. Yeah. So just to kind of look at this, just polishing the hips. Right now I'm at I'm at 154. I started polishing the hips. Oh, I'm not looking at the right thing. I started polishing the hips at 8:42. I finished at 10:30. Okay. So like, what is that, almost two hours that I just polished the character's hips, or the root, right? That is a very well invested 2 hours. If I get that part right, the rest of it starts falling into place a little easier. The idea that I could rush through that and get to the end of the animation faster is sort of faulty logic, because really what that means is I will just fight with everything every step of the way after that. So invest the time in making this part as perfect as you can. The feet, I don't think I worked quite as long on it, but you can see kind of what I'm doing on some of this, shifting frames to make it hit where I need it to. I think I'm adding some key poses here. But again, I want to make sure that before my character's weight sinks into something, there is a foot there to catch them, to absorb that weight, right? And I want to make sure that before as a character's hips are shifting past a point, it looks like another foot is pushing them, right? It's making it believable that the foot is pushing against the ground and affecting the hips, or affecting the center of gravity, the root. I don't really know that I can tell you that there's any tricks to this. It's really just looking at it and saying, does that look like pushing against the ground is working right? Does that look like the foot is getting there early enough? But it's a whole video because it's a whole pass for me. Now, sometimes what does happen, like I said, I edited the hips for 2 hours. Sometimes I'll do the translates on the hips, then I'll go do the feet, and then I'll come do the rotates on the hips, or the center of gravity. Mainly just because I need a break, right? I want to mix it up a little bit. But all of this is a pass by itself. So you can see I'm really making sure that like push off the tree is right. Trying to make sure that these feet get out here in front, and I'm adding extra keyframes where needed to make that feel appropriate. Something you can also do is you want to make sure your foot doesn't ease onto the ground. So sometimes you need to break some tangents to get that foot to slap down on the ground. So. Okay, again, it's 11:06 there. I started it at 10:50, so actually the feet didn't take too long. Right? The feet took me like 15, 20 minutes on that one. That doesn't mean you should expect that. And then this is where we'll kind of end it today. So one of the things you can note is that if the root rotates, it's usually because we're changing the entire line of action, right? That root is really going to affect what happens on your spine controls and your head control. So what I'm really looking at is now that I've made the root perfect, the center of gravity perfect, or as perfect as I can get it, how does that motion that I've now created affect the entire torso going up, right? It's more of like I'm going back and forth and scrubbing back and forth to see what did I have the root do, how would that affect the spine. Just very similarly to how you were probably analyzing the pendulum, the base would move, right? That platform would move, the pendulum would be affected, right? Now that's not always the case with this. It's not always going to drag behind it. Sometimes it's going to like lead it. But that is kind of what I'm doing as I work my way up the spine and up the head, right? If those hips hit the ground really hard, I want to make it feel like the head dragged a little bit and hit and overlapped, right? I want to be able to go through and make sure that my curve is making that happen. How much more time do I have on this one? So this is going to sound like slightly egocentric. I would encourage you to watch these closely. Like these aren't perfect, but watching somebody else's workflow is really helpful for you to understand how to adapt your own workflow or improve your own workflow. I don't expect that any of you will ever work exactly like I work, but watching somebody else work is really helpful. So we're kind of going through them a little faster here, but take some time if you get some time to just sit there and watch them and be like, I wonder why he's doing that. What's the effect of doing that? And try to see, like, why would I be editing that? Why would I be making that dip lower? There's way more information happening in this that I could possibly like dig into live. Yes.
So subtle movements like your moving holds is something done in sliding bits.
Well, sometimes when I'm posing, I will create a moving hold key, and make it like 98% of the previous key. So it's still moving just a little bit, but not a ton. But yes, the splining phase is where I make sure that it's moving enough or not too much. Some animators actually they do what's called a hold key. Is it hold key? Where they would just make a duplicate of their hold, and so the character would freeze, but then they would go into the graph editor and make that the moving hold how they wanted it. So it really works for whatever you want to do, but where I use that, like the tween machine type tools, it usually just makes sense to me to just do like a 90% of it, 98% of it, and that keeps you a little bit of motion happening in there. Moving holds there's a whole lot of different techniques for how to do some cool stuff with that. It's for stuff like your hands, right? Let's say your hand is doing the same thing for too long. What some people will do is they'll set this key, and then they'll go a little further down the timeline. They'll zero the hand out, and they'll try to see if they can set that same pose again. And what that means is even though you're close, it's still going to wiggle just a little bit, right? So this is where I was at the end of this day. This is not the end of my splining, right? But this is after I did that edit. This is where it had gotten me to. Now, again, that doesn't, it's not a huge leap forward, right? But this is where I was before I started splining. And I think you can tell the difference there, right? It feels a little springier, feels like the arcs are better. It's a little looser, still not loose enough. Like the weight is feeling better, particularly in the hips and the spine, which is where I'm at right now. Now I haven't done the arms yet, and the head pass was just sort of a first head pass. So the next video series we'll look at tomorrow, or next class period, where I sort of finish off my splining, and we're also going to look at overlapping action and depth. I feel like that's a term that doesn't get enough information about how to implement that. So, all right, 3 minutes to go. You can use those however you would like. So, I'm going to go ahead and end this and upload the video. Thank you all for being patient. Have a great day. So.